Hey everyone, welcome to Kentico Rocks podcast. This is episode 31, hosted by myself, Brian McKeiver. Kentico Rocks is the podcast about all things Kentico, Kentico Content, .NET, and Azure. Today, with episode 31, I want to talk about Kentico Content specifically. And there's a lot of topics when you mention Kentico Content, but I want to hit one that I don't think has been really oversold a ton yet, and is super important if you're actually working with Kentico Content, and that is the Management API, or also known as the Content Management API. So today we're going to talk about the Content Management API, what it can do, why you'd use it, and how I've used it in my projects. And I think that's kind of a good topic because you hear a lot about Kentico Content, the new headless CMS or content as a service tool from Kentico. And almost all the documentation and all the examples really get into the delivery API or how to consume content because you're building out your channel or your head of content to put on top of the CMS. So it does a fantastic job of kind of being able to do the different things that it does, right? So if I switch over to the content tab, in case you're watching the video, we see that it talks about better content management. And if you've used content, you know that you can create your content model, develop very strongly typed representations of content, edit, publish, collaborate, use that content in different ways. The idea is you basically can create content as a team and distribute it to a website or a mobile app or display board or anything you want to, with basically the whole idea of edit once, publish once, and distribute multiple ways. And it's a nice benefit because content as a service really is all about, it's something that's just, it's taken care of for you. It's in the cloud. It's super fast. It's powered over high-speed APIs and content delivery networks and all the latest and greatest technology basically on top of Azure. Kentico does a great job of taking care of all that for you. So you don't have some of the worries that you do with a traditional monolithic CMS install. There's no updates, there's no security, there's no patching. So there's lots of good reasons to use Kentico Content for different projects that you're doing, especially if you're looking at things like Jamstack, using Gatsby. I've talked about that in other podcasts and other things around the solutions that I deal with on my blog. And you've heard me interview Kentico's team about it. But again, most of those examples are just kind of how to put together the contents, how to structure it, how to work with the tool, and then how to consume and deliver it in almost like a shooting it down from the top and having the website work with it. And you can do crazy things with that. You can build your site. You can present a search index like I've talked about with Ryan in a couple podcast episodes back. But again, something that I haven't seen a ton of discussion about is, well, what if I want to do more than just consume the API? What if I want to do more than just read only things? What if I actually have an integration scenario and I want to put content back up to Kentico Content from my ERP or from my other solution, or maybe even Kentico EMS? Because hey, there's that new module that actually allows you to push content from Kentico EMS up into Kentico Content and then use the high-powered CDN and API that they have, which is fantastic, by the way. But again, that's all the delivery API for talking about consuming. So today, I really want to focus on the management API. I have an example worked up of how I've used it in the project, and it really is more of, it was the way I learned how to do it. It was something that I can't say it's the best way in the world, but there were enough nuances around it that it wasn't completely straightforward. The documentation does a decent job, and we can kind of show that a little bit here, of how to work with content to maybe import it or push updates to content. And right away, I'm starting at the documentation page of content docs, and it goes right away to V2. Well, if you're new to content, what is V2? That's something that maybe you don't quite understand. So a little bit of history. There was originally a content management API V1, of course, and it did some good things. It did the very basics of getting content that was new content updated to the content model in content. But it didn't do everything. So the content team had to release the second version of the management API that did a little bit more. And it adds in something like working with the workflow state, being able to publish content, set it as draft, and a few other things that we'll kind of get into later. But basically, just know that when you're working with the content management API or management API, you're going to want to be working with version 2. So even though you might not have seen V1, just trust me, you want to work with V2. And this is, to be clear, this is something that's kind of a premium feature with content. You can't use it in the very low pricing model or pricing tiers. Actually, the documents say right here that you're going to want to use it with the business plan or higher. And that's important because you want to have access to this feature if you're going to do any kind of importing scenario up to content. So just pay attention to that. Now, luckily, the management API is not all that different than the delivery API. And in this podcast, I'm going to make an assumption that you're somewhat used to the delivery API, the idea that you would hit it at like HTTPS deliver.content or, with the right API version number, the project ID. I'm assuming you have some basic knowledge of that. And if you don't, hey, go check out my blog. I talk all about what the delivery API is in older blog posts, and you can get up to speed. Or, of course, there's this great help documentation and great getting started guides on GitHub and things like that the content team has done. But so definitely, if you haven't used it, go check out the delivery API first. This is meant for a little bit more intermediate level or advanced level even of now you're doing special things and pushing content back up. So basically, you can get started by reading this documentation. I just Googled content management API, and this was the first result that came up. And it has right off the gate just a very basic level of making a curl request. This is how you're going to do most things. Now remember, this is a secure API. So you're going to need to have a bearer token in an auth header in any request that you make, whether it's curl or .NET code or whatever else language you want. And that's cool, right? Because it is a REST API. You can do any language you want in this scenario. I'm going to focus today on C# and .NET. Actually, I'm even going to show a little bit inside of Blazor because I'm working on a Blazor server-side project. And funny enough, the reason I'm working on that is I was supposed to be in Orlando in the last couple days at Orlando Code Camp talking about Blazor and content, but that didn't happen because of all this COVID craziness, which is a bummer. And by the way, total side note, again, total tangent, I hope everyone is actually doing really well in the Kentico community when it comes to the whole COVID thing. I know we here in Michigan, we're all in the stay-at-home mode. I haven't been to the office in about a week, and it's actually kind of driving me crazy. So I'm sitting here in my basement doing this podcast, and it's something I want to get done. But again, safety first, everybody. Please stay safe out there. Please stay healthy. Take the appropriate precautions. Do not be like my friends in Florida who have no idea what's going on still and are out at the beach. They're crazy, and that shouldn't happen. So, sorry, that was a little bit of a tangent. But now back to the management API. Again, this is a secure API. You're going to want to pass your authorization header and things like that. And when it comes to authentication, the API is pretty straightforward. You basically need your key. And where would you get that, right? So I'm also assuming you have already created a project in content. I'm showing one of my projects. Again, this is something that when we talk about management, of course, we're going to want the management API key. You will have to turn it on. And remember, even here on the screen, when you're looking at the settings or API keys of the content admin interface, it's tagged as a business feature. So that will let you know that you have to have business if you're not doing this. And these keys do expire, just like all good keys out there. Same thing with like Azure and certain things. Now, luckily, I've got a lot of years. Mine doesn't expire until 2031, so that's plenty of time, I think. And who knows if I'll still be doing this in 2031. But basically, you're going to copy that key and you're going to put it into your code base. That's the thing that's going to really allow you to talk to the different, methods that you need to. You're also going to need your delivery API key or your project ID in a way. I'm hoping you know how to get that as well. Please don't try to steal mine, which is why it's not shown there. But once you have those things, it's not too bad. And again, the documentation goes into some of the very, very basics. And it talks about, when you make a request, what works, what doesn't. When things aren't working, you're going to possibly get a 403 unauthorized. You're going to possibly get error messages. Luckily, with all the Kentico content APIs, they do a great job of giving you actual error messages. I really appreciate that about API developers when they do that the right way. I can't tell you how many times I've actually worked with an API that has responded with an response code 200, but actually in the message of it, it says there was an error. That's pretty frustrating and actually pretty terrible. So there's a tip for you new developers out there. Please respond with the right response codes. Also worth mentioning, when you're working with the management API to do an import, there is a rate limit. We don't want to overload the system. Chances are your processing side might not even be able to run this fast anyways, because this is actually pretty high rate limits. But it does mention that there's 10 requests per second, or 400 requests per minute, or 15,000 requests per hour. Those are, again, pretty good rates. I think this is really meant that if you're going to try to import like 100,000 items from your ERP, you might have to put some delay or some wait times in there to make sure that you're doing this in a level that gives the content system a chance to correctly react, especially if you're doing something like updating an item and then publishing it. That takes some time to distribute to the global CDN that content has. So we want to respect some boundaries there and make sure we don't try to basically denial of service attack the entire system. So rate limits are a part of this management API. And again, when it comes down to certain things, it really is all about the type of object that you're trying to work with, whether or not you're trying to create a new one with a management API, whether or not you're trying to update one that exists, or whether you're trying to create a new content version for a specific language variant, or whether you're trying to publish. All those things are doable, but they all basically rely on you knowing the right IDs for your content. So again, I'm just kind of scrolling down. At a high level, we're going to try to figure out what type of content we're importing or managing with the management API. How can we do that? And how do we do that efficiently? Okay. So I'm going to now switch to some more realistic examples. Oh, sorry. I guess one more thing. When it comes to the management API, again, the documentation is your friend, and it's going to talk about the difference between codename, ID, and external ID. Those are critically important when dealing with the management API because there's different ways to reference things. And the nice thing is, if you're doing any kind of like syncing process, where maybe you want to have your products actually update more than once from a syncing standpoint of to your ERP up to content, that's where external ID comes into play. You can actually put your system's unique identifier, or identifier, it doesn't necessarily have to be unique identifier, I guess, as the external ID into content. Therefore, you can tie the two things together because, again, content, every time you create a new item, it's going to give it its own unique identifier, and that's just ID, the internal ID of the content item, and it's also going to give it a code name. So if you want to bring these two things together in a syncing scenario, that's why you use external ID. And some of the methods rely on code name or ID, which is kind of why I'm bringing it up here. And if you're looking at the screen on the right, you can see that there's a kind of an example of what that looks like. Again, this is all JSON API. Great stuff. Good to work with. So I think a little bit enough about theory. Let's talk about real world. So I'm going to get into my scenario here a second. And to do that, I'm going to show you my content model. And this is kind of an interesting little side story, but basically for my little project here, I was working on an event where we were doing some CrossFit activities. If you know me, I'd like to do CrossFit. And one of those activities we were doing for a fundraiser was basically called rolling. And rolling is when you're doing basically a combination of using a rowing machine in an exercise context with bowling and trying to get a certain score. So the idea with rolling is you row on the machine and you try to get 100 meters exactly on the number. And for every number over 100 or any number under 100, you get points. And just like in bowling, there's 10 frames. You try to get to 100 10 times, and you keep track of the over-under numbers, and that's your score, and obviously the lower score wins. So that's why it's called rolling. In case you don't know, it's actually a lot of fun if you're someone who likes to do kind of exercise. But basically, there were teams. We had like 10 or 12 different teams at this event, and we needed a way to keep track of the scores. So my content model is all about like the team, their logo, obviously, and then their score and how many frames are left. So in this example, I'm looking at a team or a content item in content called Hustle and Muscle. Great name. We've got a little logo there for CrossFit Andal, the place that I work out at, and the score right now is showing 142. So what I did was I used the delivery API to set up my Blazor app. and I made a leaderboard. It showed all the teams, and it was doing live updates that they were on their phones. And as they were on their phones with the app, they could click a button to say increase score. And what that was doing was basically shooting requests up to the management API to update these content items and keep the score up to date. So we had to create new versions of them. We had to update a field of team score from 0 to 2 to 4 to 100. And then we had to publish these items quickly as possible. So that way when they got to the next person who did the next frame, the score would update, right? So that's the content model kind of setup. It's very, very simple, right? I try to make this a simple thing because I actually wanted to teach myself how to do this. So let me pop open the code now. And in case you have never seen Blazor, if you're looking at the code on the screen, Blazor is Microsoft's new, latest and greatest thing. It's meant to basically, the promise, I guess, is you don't have to write JavaScript to do a spa app anymore. You can use your C# skills. And it gets there somewhat. This is still kind of bleeding edge technology. This is actually Blazor server-side code. Just because I was more familiar with server-side, it made more sense for me to use this. There's also Blazor client-side, which if you're curious about that, I definitely want to give a shout out to Andre Plesny. He has a great recording on how to do Blazor client-side, and I think it even interacts with Kentico content, so I would check that out too. You can Google for that, and I'll put a show link at the bottom of the blog post page on this podcast. But basically, one of the really nice things here is that Kontent has given us an SDK for working with the management API. And if I look at my NuGet packages I have installed on this solution, you can see that I'm actually using that package. So I have the Kentico Content Delivery API, and I have the Content Management SDK. Sorry, I said API, but I meant SDK. There's the two SDKs installed. You can see I'm actually working with Blazor server-side, and I've got some actually Azure app configuration. That was another part of my talk for Orlando Code Camp, actually. And that might be a whole subject of another podcast coming up or blog post, so I'm not going to talk about it now, but that's some really cool things you can do with Azure app configuration. But today, again, we want to focus on the Kentico Content Management SDK. So I've added that through NuGet. It's already there. And what that does is it gives me access to the management libraries in C#. So if you're looking at the screen, and I'll narrate a little bit, I'm actually using kentico.content.management from a namespace standpoint at the top of my page. And I have a really simple service lined up. The service is basically meant so that we can do some dependency injection and use the management client. Again, very similar to the delivery client if you're used to content, but the management client allows us to use the management API. Very big shocker. However, one important thing to note, the SDK that I'm currently using supports Content Management API version 1. It does not support version 2. So with version 1, I get some of the things I need, but I actually had to roll my own service to work with the V2 API because the SDK does not yet support the V2 API all the way. Now, Content's working on this. I've been talking to them a little bit. It's on their roadmap. They're going to get to it. I know they will, but basically, for right now, that's the scenario. We're actually using the SDK for the majority of things, and I'll show you how we're going to actually call the V2 API just with pure HTTP client as opposed to the SDK. And I hope that makes sense for those listening. But basically, you can see when I'm working with my management client, I am really just kind of make sure I have my keys. So I have that API key I grabbed from the content screen in API's keys page, and I have my project ID, and then I'm just newing up the client, right? So that was pretty simple. And let's go to where I'm using this. So I have a method in my team service that allows me to basically kind of get the teams from the delivery API, but also update them. And now you can see I'm actually using the management service at the top of the screen. I'm injecting it into my constructor through some DI. And basically I'm going to go down to where am I wanting to update the teams. Because again, I don't have time to demo the entire app today. I'm skipping over the delivery aspect, trying to focus on the management aspect of it. But basically, when it's the right time in the UI, I'm passing a team
which has a team name, a team logo, a team score, and how many frames are left. Because again, if you're like halfway into the game, maybe you have, we are indicating the progress by saying I'm done with this frame and I only have 4 frames left now. Basically, the important aspect here is I have the code name of the team. And the code name is, again, coming from Kentico Content. It's the nice formatted technical name of Hustle and Muscle from the original example. And I'm getting the identifiers. And a lot of the documentation talks about the identifiers. Again, the code name, the ID, and the external ID. And this is used, these identifiers are used in multiple places when you work with the management API. So what I try to do is I try to make a little helper, and it returns a tuple of the content item identifier, the language identifier, because that's a very critical piece that I haven't really talked about yet, and the content variant item. So anytime that you're working with the management API, you need those 3 things that represent which content item I'm updating, which language variant I'm updating, because everything always has to have a language variant, and other identifiers. So I'll just right click and go to definition on that. So you can see, luckily this comes from the management SDK. I didn't have to make this, but basically if I'm passing it a code name, there's a built-in SDK function that says content item identifier by code name from my item code name, and that gets me the content item identifier. I know it's a lot to say, and hopefully you are watching. I'm also getting the language identifier for using based off my default language of my project, because in my example, I'm only using the English language. So I have a default language code, so I'm cheating there a little bit. You might have to get it from your context if you're doing this in a different app. And then I have the basically slamming those 2 things together, the content item identifier and language identifier, to get the content item variant identifier, because that actually is the really real unique thing about this content item. And this helper just returns that back to me. So once I have those, I'm just using the generated model for the team. And again, I'm assuming you've already done that with the delivery side of things, creating that. And then I'm calling something that actually isn't in the regular SDK. I'm actually calling something that will create a new content item. And now we're into workflow. And this is where the original management SDK doesn't quite work. We have to do things with the version 2 API of management. So to do this, think about it. I have this team and it's already under workflow because I want to have an edit mode and a publish mode. So it isn't just import an item. It's actually basically check out an item or create a new version of an item. Then we call an upsert method. And then after that, we publish it. So here's where I'm kind of mixing version 1 and version 2 to make all this happen. So the management beta service is my representation of the version 2 call. And let's take a look at that. I'm going to navigate or go to definition on that feature. And you can see as I look at this, I'm now not using content management from a library standpoint. I'm actually just using HTTP client. And here I have a generic HTTP client. I'm doing the same thing from an authorization standpoint, adding a bearer token to the header. And I have a few methods in this service that allows me to create a new content item version, to publish a content item, and to make just kind of a generic put request to certain things in the management API. So luckily, this is just something that it's a good example of. It doesn't matter what language or what library or SDK you're using to work with the management API. You can do this from all over. The cool thing is, it's write it in your own language of choice, which is what I appreciate about this type of a solution and this type of a CMS. So I have that method, which really just makes a put request to this type of a URL. Again, you basically have to work with your project ID because everything in the APIs are always about your project ID first. And then the items with an item identifier. That's why we talked about those identifiers a second ago. And we're making a new language variant. So we're going with a /variants /language identifier. And then new version is the actual endpoint to create that new language version item. And then I'm assuming it's working, so I'm just returning if it is successful or not in that method. Okay. So this basically creates that new version, and the UI immediately will respond in content. So if you put a breakpoint here and you made it work, it would just work. It's pretty nice. Then doing an upsert. This is specific to the version 1 management API. So if I hover over it, you can see that upsert does an insert or update a given content item variant. And you could call this without doing the line before if you didn't have workflow involved, and it would work because the management API version 1 actually will completely create and update an item without workflow. But chances are you have workflow because that's a best practice in content. So again, we're creating a new version. We're doing an upsert, which does that update to that team. It passes the identifier of the content item variant identifier, and it passes my update model, which you can see above. I've updated the team score and the team frames left. And then once that finishes, I'm actually then calling back to the V2 API and saying publish that content item based off the code name of the item that we just wanted to update or upsert. And that all works. So this is asynchronous code. We're doing an await, but assuming it comes back with a success. I've actually never seen publish not come back with a success as long as I've had the right code name. And then from there we have, actually this is just kind of I'm caching the local memory because there's some signal R going on with Blazor. So you have to kind of watch out for that. And then if there is an error, I'm just kind of showing the error just because this is, just for me, I'm not actually logging it anywhere. But that's all it takes. So the key here is I just want to really hone in. If you're looking straight up at the documentation and you don't really recognize the fact that workflow is involved, you may think that I only have to call this upsert content item variant and things will just work. But actually, you can't if you have workflow involved. So you need these couple different lines of code to make this work. And talking about making it work, let's actually show some of this now. And actually, I'm going to run the application, which might take some second or two because I actually haven't ran this today. Actually, I haven't ran this in a while because, since the conference has been canceled, I kind of didn't have to do my prep this week. But what this is doing is it's building .NET Core 3.1 and starting up the Blazor middleware. It's connecting our server to the .NET Core server and starting up Signal R. It does take some time, and there we go. Now it's done compiling. You can see it's listening on port 5001, and as it does that, it's actually going to pop up in a browser instance for me, and there we go. You guys can't see any of this because I forgot you're on the other screen. So there is the application we're looking at, and I got to move this out of the way so I can see myself. You can see I've got a little bit of a dashboard, and we talked about hustle and muscle. So there they are right there. They're in 16th place. Well, they were in 16th place. I forgot I have live reload enabled. I forgot to turn that feature off. So you can see they moved, they reset because someone else had a score. So I'm going to click that. Here you can see hustle and muscle. The current score is 142. I'm going to actually click the add to current score button, and the score went right up to 143. The screen it paused there for a second. It was waiting for the publish to finish because it does take a second or two. That's the other thing about the management API. It actually takes a second or two for you to do this. And we went from 142 to 143. The buttons came back, and that means things worked. So just to prove this is all working, actually, I'm going to go up and back into content. Wherever that is. There it is. Oh, and you can see someone edited this page in content because we had this open in the user interface. One cool feature about content is that if there's two people editing or if there's an automation involved of editing an item, it gives you a notice. Hey, there was something that happened. So originally we were at 142. We ran through that code. I'm going to call refresh. And now we're at 143 and the content item is published. And if you look at workflow, you can see it was published today at 9:09 a.m. So pretty cool, right? That you can do all that from a code standpoint, and you don't have to just do it manually through the UI. And again, that's using the Content Management API version 2. And had a little fun with Blazor learning along the way. If we go back to our leaderboard, you can actually see that they're probably going to be further down the list now because they have a higher score. Where'd they go? There they are. Oh, actually in there twice. Interesting. That could be because I actually have 2 team names called that, but we're going to skip over that for now. That is the idea of using the content management API. So again, if you're not sure how or where to do that exactly, I definitely would check out the documentation, which I'm showing back on the screen now again. It goes through all of those items and methods. I didn't necessarily hit every single detail because that's well listed in there. The other thing is you can actually get to the GitHub of the SDK, I believe. So here it is. You can check out the source. You can check out how things work. The management API is kind of this is actually, I probably should have mentioned this at the beginning. The great place to start is actually on GitHub, where they have the content management SDK for .NET documented, and it talks about some of the things I've mentioned, and it has some very, very, very quick basics of how to do these things. So that's another good resource, and again, I'll put that in the show link. But really, that's kind of my review of the management API. Again, remember, you might have to mix the SDK as well as a way to consume version 2. Hopefully, Content fixes that soon. But I think that's all for today. I've kept you quite long. I hope you've enjoyed Kentico Rocks podcast, episode number 31. Thank you very much.